I'm going to now ask Jo-Hanna Ivers to join us. Jo-Hanna is an Associate Professor in Addiction and School at the School of Medicine and Associate Dean of Civic Engagement and Social Innovation from Trinity College Dublin. And as I mentioned earlier on, I'm very pleased that Jo-Hanna has joined us on the advisory group to help us. So you'll be seeing plenty of Jo-Hanna as we move on. And Jo-Hanna, you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. I suppose one thing I just want to talk about before I get into the presentation is thank you for the introduction. And I suppose what that lists is my professional qualifications. But I also bring another perspective, or hope to bring it to the Assembly, and that is that I am unfortunately a family member of both immediate and extended family who have died from addiction. I grew up in the North Inner City and born and raised there till my mid-20s. I was a late bloomer. But my family are still there, and anybody that knows anything about the North Inner City, they'll know that drug use and addiction is highly prevalent there. And what that meant was that I didn't just lose family members, I lost community members, school friends, but I also gained this insight into addiction that I think is quite unique. And so that's what drives me in my daily work. That's what keeps me going. It's what makes me passionate about addiction. And so I also hope to bring that here. I do know I've wasted a minute on that. So we've 15 minutes, and I'm going to try and get through the reasons, I suppose, we're here. And that is, so I really want to talk you through the why people use drugs, how people use drugs, what we're talking about when we're talking about drug users and the drugs that they use. Are we always talking about the same thing? The benefits, the harms, and ultimately why we treat one group of drug users quite differently to others. So this is jumping ahead. So very simply, people use drugs for one of two reasons. They either want to stop feeling something or they want to start feeling something. So people, they may want to start to feel relaxed or stop feeling stressed. Or start to get away from a pain. But ultimately, they're the reasons that drive people for using drugs. And again, very superficially or very quickly, there are 4 ways to use a drug, and that is orally, injecting, inhalation, and absorption. Injection is obviously the most direct, but also the most dangerous. Something bizarre is going on with this, sorry. So when we think about drug use, and I suppose the point of me talking today is about drug use in the broadest sense, because the job of the Assembly is really to look at drug use in Irish society, and it doesn't just mean addiction. It means, as I say, the beneficial use, the non-problematic use, and indeed then the chronic dependence and addiction. So with that said, can someone help me? Sorry. So the Canadians have done a really good job of putting drug use on a spectrum, and it's really helpful when we're trying to understand drug use from a population level, because like I say, you're talking about that from the very beneficial, non-problematic, through to problematic, up into chronic dependence and ending in addiction. Issues to consider when we're thinking about people on a spectrum. Is all drug use problematic? No, not all drug use is problematic. In fact, the high majority of drug use coming from people who use drugs is that it doesn't cause them that much consequence or perceived consequence, and indeed sometimes it can be beneficial. So if we look at the case of Sharon is age 40, she vapes cannabis before bed because it relaxes her, and she doesn't use it when she goes on holidays. So the thing about Sharon is she's getting a direct benefit from her drug use, and when she alleviates that use or that need for the use by going on holidays and relaxing, she doesn't use it. So we could very firmly place Sharon on the spectrum of either beneficial but certainly not problematic drug use, except for we always have to be aware of the other sides of or the other dimensions to people. So things we'd like to consider about Sharon is, does she have a psychiatric illness? Is she otherwise physically healthy? Is she pregnant? And where is she sourcing her drugs? And the reason I ask that is, are they contaminated or do they come with other adulterants? So these are the things that we need to understand when we're trying to get to the beneficial use. Other issues to consider is, as I say, 90% of drug users perceive their drug use to be either beneficial or non-problematic. The spectrum applies to legal drugs and illegal drugs. So in other words, I can use drugs that are on prescription, I can overly use drugs that are on prescription, or I can be using illicit drugs. Drugs can change and drug use can change. It can be beneficial to me now and detrimental to me later, or indeed I can resolve a drug and alcohol problem and then reintroduce it as well. So it's quite fluid. There's a false belief that there are certain substances that we take once and we become addicted. For the same reason, a drug can be problematic and non-problematic to the same person at the same time. So in other words, I could take a drink, the alcohol is not the problem, but if I get in my car, it causes me a problem. The other thing is, Paul mentioned knowledge and science and evidence base. The knowledge of risk and changes over time, and I think the very key example of this is wine. A couple of years ago, we were all told, have a couple of glasses of wine, it'll improve your cardiovascular health. Well, guess what? A couple of glasses of wine now, we know, will contribute to your risk of cancer. So I suppose this comes to the crux of why we're all kind of here. This notion that drugs are the problem, we should keep people away from drugs, or no, people are the problem, we should keep the people away from the drugs. The trouble is we're rarely talking about the same thing. We're often talking about different people using different drugs that have many different, as Paul has pointed out, outcomes, adversities. The contexts are different, and so often we enter into this conversation when we just think we're simply talking about drug use and drug users and making something available and everything will be fine. But it's a little bit more complex than that. So I suppose, and this is not a complete list, but it will give you an insight into understanding the various populations and both the immediate and enduring harms that they might come in contact with. So someone that's less complex, they're a healthy person, physically healthy, psychologically healthy, well connected with their community, good relationships, engaged in employment or education. They use an unregulated high potency drug like an MPS. They're not immune. The likelihood of using a high potency drug at any time to any individual may lead to drug-specific mortality. So in other words, if you use a drug like that, you may die. Again, borrowing that less complex profile of a person using a regulated or a stable drug. So again, we'll talk about alcohol. You could see that person over time could have a drug-related mortality. So in other words, it won't kill them immediately, but it may lead to mouth cancer that could kill them. As we move along that spectrum and we start to consider other populations and other types of drugs, we again see the more complex person who has less social and personal capital. So they may not be connected with community, they may not have access to job, they may not have access to employment, supports or education, and their capital is pretty low. Again, they're not immune to that high potency unregulated drug. They take it, they may die because of the risk of that drug. But as we move on then and we take the same profile of person and we look at that regulated stable drug use, so again that can be prescription or non-prescription, we can see that can lead, so again, drugs like benzodiazepines, methadone, heroin, again, that can contribute to their risk of death and addiction over time. So what I'm trying to labour is that we're talking about very complex issues when we lump drugs and drug users into the mix. And what we need to, I suppose, when we try to understand and classify those harms, it becomes really important, because this is an illustration taken from a paper by David Nutt and co. It was a pretty controversial paper. Lots of key strengths, lots of limitations. I think the biggest limitation being that Paul says we've moved on in drug use, so the categorisation in there of harms no longer apply as they did maybe 13 years ago. But what these guys did was they broke down the harms that drugs cause, not just to the individual, but also to the people that are in their immediate space, so their family, their community, and then society. And it looked at those harms in terms of physical, psychological, and social harm, so biopsychosocial, as we talk about. And again, looking at those key things that if I use a drug, it may kill me. If I use a drug over time, it may lead to my death. If I use a drug, it may cause me damage now or down the line. It may lead to dependence. It can lead to immediate impairment of my mental health or a long-term effect. It can contribute to the loss of tangibles, so my job, my relationships, my financial stability, and equally, as I say, relationships can die off. As we move then into the people who spend time with people who use drugs and are either in their community or indeed in society, again, we look at those psychological harms, physical harms, both to others and, as I say, community. And you're looking at things like injury that's caused through drug use. You're looking at maybe crime that's committed, environmental damage, adverse family events. And these are a big ticket item. When we're talking about harms, and I was glad Paul mentioned it, they're not always visible harms, but we're starting to get to know that literature that talks about the hidden harms and the adversities that people deal with. And so when we're talking about drug use and drug users, we can't separate it from those types of harms. But in saying that, we also need to stop villainising and stigmatising drug users and drugs and the people who use them. We have a way of, I suppose, if a drug is a medicine, we downgrade it and we look at people differently. If someone orally takes a drug, we look at them differently. If someone is from a certain social class and takes a drug, we look at them differently. So why do we stigmatise drug users in the way that we do? And we very much do. So when we think about, you wouldn't think I did this for a living. But anyway, when we think about stigma and how we stigmatise certain people and certain users over another, this, I mean, obviously I have a keen interest in neurobiology of addiction, but this picture really sums it up for me. If we're talking about pain from, you know, whether that's a social pain, so you're talking about a childhood adversity, poverty, some kind of form of abuse, that's, you know, a social pain. A physical pain can be a gaping fracture. We see here that the body doesn't discriminate how we manifest pain. It manifests itself in exactly the same way, in exactly the same site. And ironically, we treat that pain, be it social or physical, with the same drug, because we either give people morphine for a gaping fracture, or someone might enter into taking heroin, which is an identical drug for exactly the same reason, but by some reason we want to stigmatise those users. Because there's this old hang-up that addiction is and dependence is in some way a moral failing or a genetic fate. But actually we know from science that yes, someone can have a predisposition, but it doesn't necessarily have to be activated. But if they do have a pain or a trauma, that will raise the likelihood of them to go on to be dependent or addicted. And if they find something that will numb that pain, they'll hold on to that for a while. what does science tell us absolutely about people who develop an addiction? And I think if we get to grips with this over the course of the process, it will be job well done. So people who have a co-occurring psychiatric illness, people who experience pain, be it physical or social, or carry a physical illness, people who have limited opportunities to work, education and meaningful relationships all go on, or are all more likely to go on to be addicted. But what I want people to consider is the level of complexity and the weight of the issues that people who are addicted to drugs have to get through, the barriers that they face. I'm out of time, but thank you.